You know when you give 32 years of your life to a man and he throws it all away for a fling with a woman 20 years younger? You think the world has ended, but today I want to tell you how that ending was, in fact, my true beginning. Hello, my dears. I'm Celia. I'm 78 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story I've kept for a long time. Before I start, if you're watching this video, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching so many different places. I was born in 1946, in a time very different from yours. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a simple house with my parents and 3 siblings. My mother taught me to sew when I was just 9 years old. Celia, she would say, a woman needs to have a skill. And so, between play and chores, I learned to transform scraps into small works of art. At 18 in 1964, I was working as a seamstress in a small shop downtown. I didn't earn much, but it was enough to help at home and save a little for my hope chest. Back then, every girl dreamed of getting married, having children, building a family, and I was no different. It was on an April afternoon that he first walked into the shop. Frank was 22 years old. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that lit up the room. He was looking for a gift for his mother and ended up leaving with an embroidered handkerchief and my phone number. I remember it like it was yesterday. He had a natural elegance, even though he was a simple guy, recently graduated in accounting and just starting his career. Our courtship was like something from an old movie. He would pick me up at home. We'd talk on the porch under my father's watchful eye. We'd go to the movies on Sundays. After a year, he asked for my hand in marriage. We got married in May 1965 in a simple ceremony at our neighborhood church. I made my own dress, a lace and satin design I had seen in a magazine. Our first home was a rented apartment, so small that when we opened the sofa bed, there was barely room to walk. We slept on a mattress on the floor. We had just a table, 2 chairs, and an old cabinet my mother gave us. But we were happy, you know? That true happiness of those who are building something together, brick by brick. In the early years, I continued sewing at home to supplement our income while Frank worked at an accounting firm. At night, he studied to advance his career. Sometimes we'd stay up late, me sewing, him bent over his books, and we'd share dreams about the future. In 1967, our first son was born, Charles. It was the greatest joy of our lives. I remember Frank crying when he held the boy for the first time. We're going to give him everything, Celia, everything we didn't have. In 1970 came Marianne, and in 1974, Christine. Our family was complete. Life wasn't easy with 3 small children. I washed clothes by hand because a washing machine was a luxury we couldn't afford. I baked bread at home to save money. I mended the children's clothes until I couldn't anymore. But there was always food on the table. The children went to school, and little by little, very gradually, life improved. In 1975, we managed to buy our first house, a simple 2-story in a distant neighborhood. It was also the year Frank was promoted to manager at the office where he worked. I remember the day we arrived with the moving truck. It was a small house, needing repairs, but it was ours. I planted roses in the front yard and a cherry tree in the back. The children each had their own little space. It was our paradise. The years went by, the children growing, Frank prospering in his career. In 1982, he decided to open his own accounting firm with a partner. It was a tight period. We mortgaged the house to get the initial capital. We spent sleepless nights, worried if we had made the right choice. But it worked. The firm grew, gained important clients, and within a few years we were in a comfortable financial situation for the first time in our lives. We could renovate the house, buy a new car, our first brand new one. The children went to good schools. In 1985, we took our first family vacation. We went to California. I'll never forget my children's eyes seeing the ocean for the first time. The 80s were good to us. We worked hard, but reaped the rewards. Frank became a respected accountant in the city, with his own office and several employees. I continued sewing, but now for pleasure, not necessity. I made party dresses for friends, clothes for the grandchildren who were starting to arrive. We had our friends, our Sunday family gatherings, our little traditions. In 1992, we celebrated our silver anniversary, 25 years of marriage. We threw a party at the church hall. We renewed our vows. Frank gave me a diamond ring, the first of my life. We were surrounded by our children, our first grandchildren, friends. I felt like the happiest woman in the world. It was around 1995 that I began to notice small changes. Frank was coming home later and later from work. He talked about expanding the business, about new clients who demanded more time. He bought new clothes, more modern ones, an expensive watch. He started going to the gym. Concerned for my health, he said. At first, I thought it was all natural. After all, we were getting older. It was normal to want to take better care of oneself. Mary Ann got married in 1996. Charles was already married with 2 children. Christine was in medical school. The house started to feel empty. It was just me and Frank now, and suddenly it seemed we no longer knew how to talk to each other. Meals were silent. He spent more and more time at the office. When I asked about work, I received vague answers. Boring accounting stuff, Celia, you wouldn't understand. I started finding receipts from expensive restaurants in his coat pockets, places we had never been together. Sometimes I smelled a different perfume on his shirts, nothing too obvious, just subtleties. But after so many years together, you know your husband. You know when something is different. I talked to my friends. They said it was nonsense, that men that age always have a crisis, that it would pass soon. Buy some new lingerie, they suggested. Make a special dinner. And I tried. Oh, how I tried. I started wearing more makeup, taking better care of myself. I made candle-lit dinners. I tried to initiate conversations about the future, about trips we could take now that the children were grown. But Frank seemed increasingly distant. When he was home, he spent hours watching television. He barely touched me anymore. He said he was tired, stressed from work, and I, foolish that I was, believed him. Or maybe I just chose to believe, because the truth would be too painful. In May 1997, we completed 32 years of marriage. I hoped he would remember, that he would plan something special. But the date passed without acknowledgement. He left early for work, as always, and said he had an important meeting that night. He'd be back late. Don't wait up for dinner. That's when I had the idea to surprise him. I prepared a basket with the wine we had drunk on our wedding day. We kept a bottle for special occasions. I made the chocolate cake he loved so much. I wore my best dress. I put on special perfume. I took a cab to his office, imagining his surprise, his smile when he saw me. It was almost 9 p.m. when I arrived. The building was practically empty, just a few security guards in the lobby. I went up to the floor of his office. Most of the rooms were dark, but the light in Frank's office was on. My heart beat faster. I was anxious, like a girl on her first date. I opened the door without knocking, wanting to surprise him, and I was the one who got the surprise. There, leaning over his desk, were Frank and a young woman, so young she could have been our daughter. They were, well, you can imagine. The sound of the door made them separate, startled. The cake slipped from my hands and fell to the floor. It was as if time had stopped. I stood paralyzed at the door, my legs shaking so much I thought I would collapse right there. 32 years of marriage, 3 children raised, and there was my husband, the man I chose for life, in the arms of another woman. She composed herself quickly. She was beautiful, very beautiful. Long hair, young body, the kind of beauty that makes men turn their heads on the street. She grabbed her purse and left, passing by me without saying a word. She just looked at me with a mixture of surprise and pity? Yes, I think it was pity. Frank stood there behind the desk, adjusting his tie, his face a mask of embarrassment and irritation. Not shame or regret, mind you, irritation at being caught. "What are you doing here, Celia?" he asked, as if I were the intruder, as if I had done something wrong. I couldn't answer. I simply turned around and left. I went down the stairs. I don't even remember how. I walked through the city aimlessly for hours. The night was cold, but I didn't even feel it. Inside me, something had broken, something that would never be fixed. I didn't go home that night. I sat on a park bench until dawn, staring at nothing, trying to understand how my life had reached that point. When I finally returned, Frank was already there, sitting in the kitchen, as if waiting for me. He hadn't even called to find out where I was. I sat at the table, still in my clothes from the night before, my eyes swollen from crying so much. We were silent for a long time. I wanted him to speak first, to explain, to ask for forgiveness. Finally, he sighed and said, "Her name is Amanda. She's been working at the office for 2 years. She's my administrative assistant." Just that. As if he were introducing me to someone at a party. There was no remorse in his voice, just exhaustion, as if he could finally take a weight off his shoulders. "How long?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "1.5 years," he answered without hesitation. 1.5 years. While I prepared his favorite dinners, washed his clothes, worried about his health, he was with her. 1.5 years of lies, excuses, betrayal. Why? The question all betrayed women ask, as if there were an answer that could justify it, that could ease the pain. It was then that he looked at me coldly and said, "What did you expect, Celia? Look at you and look at her. You spent your life taking care of others and forgot about yourself. Amanda makes me feel alive again." Those words were like knives in my heart. I was 52 at the time. I was no longer the 18-year-old he met, of course. I had the marks of time, a body transformed by 3 pregnancies, the weariness of a life of work. But I was the same person who had walked beside him for more than 3 decades, who had held his hand in difficult times, who had believed in him when no one else did. Something inside me broke at that moment. I stood up, grabbed the framed photo of our wedding that sat on top of the refrigerator, and threw it against the wall. The glass shattered, just like my marriage, my trust, my life as I knew it. I screamed, I cried, I said things I never thought I would say. Frank just watched, impassive, as if watching a bad movie. When I finally calmed down, exhausted, he simply said that he had already consulted a lawyer, that he wanted a divorce as quickly as possible, that he would give me a fair share of the assets, that we didn't need to make this harder than it already was. Harder? He spoke as if we were discussing the division of a business partnership, not the end of a life built together. As if I were an employee being laid off, not the woman with whom he had shared a bed for 32 years, with whom he had raised 3 children. The days that followed were the worst of my life. I couldn't eat, sleep, function. I lost 27 pounds in a month. I spent sleepless nights, going over memories, trying to understand where I had gone wrong, what I could have done differently. The children tried to console me, torn between loyalty to their father and concern for me. The neighbors whispered. I felt the shame of being left, abandoned after so many years. Rock bottom came on a rainy June afternoon. I had gone out to buy bread, one of the few times I managed to force myself out of the house in those weeks. Passing by a restaurant downtown, I saw Frank and Amanda sitting by the window. They didn't see me, but I stood there in the rain, watching how they laughed, how they touched each other, how Frank looked at her the same way he once looked at me. That night, I came home soaked, feverish, at the limit of physical and emotional exhaustion. I opened the bottle of sleeping pills the doctor had prescribed. I thought it would be easier to end it all, to stop feeling that pain that seemed endless. But when I already had the pills in my hand, I saw the picture of my children on the nightstand. Charles, Marianne, Christine, their smiling faces, confident, and I thought, I'm not going to give him the satisfaction of destroying me completely. I'm not going to make my children go through this. I put the pills back in the bottle. I cried until I had no more tears. And then, in the silence of that room that now seemed too big for me alone, I made a promise to myself. This would not be the end of my story. The next day, when the sun rose, something had changed inside me. The pain was still there, of course, and would be for a long time, but along with it had been born a fierce determination, a will to show him, myself, the world, that Celia was not just Frank's wife, that I was much more than the role I had played for so many years. I didn't know yet how this new beginning would be, what form this new life would take. I knew only that somehow I would survive, and more than that, I would find a way to be happy again, however impossible that seemed at that moment. The months following the discovery of the betrayal were the darkest of my life. July 1997 arrived with a particularly harsh winter in Portland, and the cold outside seemed to reflect the ice that took over my heart. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, cold and impersonal, like those papers full of legal terms I barely understood. Frank had left home a week after our confrontation. He took only his clothes and personal belongings, saying I could keep the rest for now, as if he were doing me a favor. I learned later that he was living in an apartment downtown, not far from his office. I didn't need much imagination to know that Amanda frequented the place. Our house, the one we built together, suddenly seemed too big and strangely empty. At night, the silence was deafening. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching the furniture, looking at the photographs on the walls, portraits of a family that no longer existed, at least not in the way I knew it. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, though it weighed heavily. The worst part was the memories. Every corner of that house held a piece of our history. The mark on the kitchen wall where we measured the children's heights, the worn spot on the sofa arm where Frank always sat to read the newspaper, the small garden we planted together in the back. I couldn't look at anything without a memory hitting me, opening wounds that had barely begun to heal. The children took turns keeping me company. Charles would come have lunch with me on his days off. Marianne called every day, worried. Christine, who was finishing college in San Francisco, came back home for a few weeks, claiming she needed to research something at the local university library. I knew it was a lie, that she had interrupted her studies because of me, and that only increased my guilt. Because I felt guilty, you know? However absurd it may seem, guilty for not having noticed earlier, for not having been enough, for causing worry to my children, and especially guilty for not being able to get back on my feet quickly. Why was it so hard? Why couldn't I just move on, as everyone advised me? In August, the lawyer called to say that Frank had made an offer. I would sell my share of the house to him, and with that money, I would buy a smaller place for myself. The accounting firm would remain entirely his, of course. After all, he was the one who built the business. I would receive a monthly alimony, generous, according to the lawyer, but which would barely cover my basic expenses. When I hung up the phone, I had a crying fit that lasted for hours. It wasn't just the financial aspect, though that was frightening. I hadn't worked formally in recent decades. I had no retirement of my own. I was completely dependent on Frank. It was the injustice of it all, as if my years of dedication to that family, of unpaid work inside the home, of constant support so he could dedicate himself to his career, were worth nothing. It was Marianne who shook me out of that state. She arrived unannounced one afternoon and found me still in my pajamas at 3 p.m., the house a mess, me not eating properly for days. "Enough, Mom," she said with a firmness that surprised me. "Let's take a shower, put on decent clothes, and get out of here." I tried to argue that I wasn't in the mood, that I preferred to stay home, but she was unyielding. Half an hour later, there I was, showered, hair combed for the first time in days, being practically dragged out of the house. Marianne took me to a cafe downtown, a small, cozy place with wooden tables and a delicious aroma of fresh coffee and homemade cakes. While we waited for our order, she took my hand across the table. "You need to react, Mom. Not for me, not for Dad, not for anyone, for yourself." I tried to explain how hard it was, how lost I felt, how I didn't even know where to start. She listened patiently, her eyes so much like mine, full of understanding and a wisdom I didn't expect to find in someone so young. "You know what I learned when Peter broke up with me last year?" she said, referring to the boyfriend who had left her after 3 years together. "That no one can define my worth, not a man, not society, no one. Only I can do that." Her words stayed with me. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, they echoed in my mind. Who was I, after all? I had been a daughter, a wife, a mother, always defined in relation to someone else. But who was Celia? Just Celia. The next day, I woke up determined to make at least one concrete change. I called the lawyer and said I wouldn't accept Frank's offer. I wanted half of everything: the house, the firm, the investments. After all, that wealth had been built during our marriage with my support and sacrifice too. The lawyer seemed surprised by my determination. He promised to talk to the other party and call me back. When I hung up, I felt a mixture of terror and euphoria. It was the first time in weeks that I had made a decision for myself, that I had stood my ground. The feeling was frightening and at the same time liberating. At the end of August, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Teresa, a lady who attended the same church as me, though I hadn't been regular lately. She coordinated a support group for women in vulnerable situations and was inviting me to participate in the next meeting. My first impulse was to refuse. I didn't feel comfortable exposing my situation to strangers, opening up about something that still caused me so much shame. But Teresa was gently insistent. "Sometimes, Celia, just hearing other stories makes us feel less alone. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." I ended up agreeing, more to end the conversation than out of real interest. The following Thursday, there I was, sitting in a circle with 8 other women in a small room attached to the church. Some were my age, others younger, 1 or 2 older, all with stories of losses, abandonments, violence, some much worse than mine. I stayed silent most of the time, just listening. But when Teresa asked me directly if I would like to share something, I surprised myself by speaking. The words came out hesitantly at first, then like a torrent. I told about the 32 years of marriage, about the betrayal, about the fear of the future. When I finished, there were tears in the eyes of several women, and for the first time, they weren't just tears of pain in mine, but also of relief from sharing that weight. One of the ladies, Mrs. Odette, waited for everyone to leave to come talk to me. She was almost 70 and had been left by her husband 10 years earlier, after 4 decades of marriage. "At first, I also thought my life was over," she told me, with a serene smile that intrigued me. "But you know what? It was only then that it really began." She told me how she had rebuilt her life, how she had discovered passions and talents she didn't even know she had, how she had made true friendships, traveled, rediscovered herself. "The best revenge is living well, Celia," she said as she said goodbye. "Live so well that he regrets every day having left you." I went home that night with those words in my head. Living well was a concept so distant for me at that moment that it seemed almost a bad joke. How could I live well, abandoned at 52, with an uncertain future ahead? But the seed had been planted. In the following weeks, I continued attending the group. Each meeting was like a small step out of the abyss into which I had fallen. I began to open up more, to listen attentively to the stories of other women, to absorb their advice and experiences. One of them, Lucia, had turned her hobby of painting into a small source of income after her divorce. Another gave private English lessons at home. Mrs. Odette, the lady who had talked to me on the first day, sold homemade sweets to supplement her retirement. "You used to sew, didn't you?" Teresa asked at one of the meetings. "Why don't you go back to doing that? Many women here need small repairs, hems, adjustments." The idea seemed absurd at first. I hadn't sewn professionally in years, just small repairs for family and friends. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea made sense. It was something I knew how to do, that didn't require a big initial investment, that I could start slowly. In September, when Mrs. Odette got sick with a bad flu, she called me asking for help. She had an order of brownies to deliver for a children's party that weekend and wasn't in any condition to make them. I agreed to help more out of solidarity than for any other reason. I spent the entire night in the kitchen making the sweets according to the recipe she gave me over the phone. It was a simple recipe, traditional brownies, but I remembered a variation my mother used to make with a touch of cinnamon and orange zest that gave it a special flavor. I decided to make half the order the traditional way and half with that variation, marking the packages to differentiate them. The next day, Mrs. Odette called me enthusiastically. The client had loved them, especially the brownies with the special touch. She wanted to know if she could order more for another party. I told her you were just helping me, Mrs. Odette explained, but she insisted, said she would pay well. What do you think, Celia? I hesitated. Making sweets had never been my forte. I knew some basic recipes, the ones my mother had taught me, but nothing extraordinary. On the other hand, the extra money would be welcome, especially now that the divorce process was dragging on and my financial situation was uncertain. I'll think about it, I replied without much enthusiasm. At the group meeting that week, I told them about the episode. To my surprise, several women showed interest. One of them would have a baby shower the following month and needed sweets. Another wanted something for her grandson's birthday party. "See," said Teresa with an encouraging smile. "Sometimes opportunities arise when we least expect them. We just have to be open to them." I went home that night with 3 small orders, 2 baby showers and a children's birthday party. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Something to occupy my mind, my hands, and that could bring some extra money. The next morning, I opened my mother's old recipe book. I flipped through the yellowed pages, looking at the handwritten notes, the spatters that stained some sheets. Silent witnesses to so many recipes tested over the years. At the back of the book, I found a section titled Party Sweets, recipes my mother made only on special occasions. Some I didn't even remember tasting. I spent the day testing some of them. Brownies, coconut kisses, peanut candies, the traditional sweets that couldn't be missing from any party in my youth. But I also experimented with variations, brownies with coffee, with cinnamon, with orange zest, coconut kisses with toasted coconut, peanut candies with a touch of ginger. The kitchen, which had become an almost hostile place in recent months, a space where I barely entered to make the basics for my survival, began to fill again with aromas, movements, life. I found myself humming while stirring the condensed milk in the pan, an old habit I had forgotten. When the sweets were ready, I needed someone to try them and give me an honest opinion. I called Marianne, who came with her husband and little daughter, my 3-year-old granddaughter. Seeing them sitting at the kitchen table, trying the sweets, complimenting, making suggestions, brought a feeling I hadn't had in months, the feeling of being useful, of creating something that brought joy. "Mom, this is delicious," said Marianne, biting into a coffee brownie. "Are you sure you've never done this professionally before?" The question made me smile. No, I had never made sweets to sell. I cooked for the family, of course, but my culinary talents had always been geared toward everyday meals, not festive treats. "It's a start," I replied without much conviction yet. But it really was a start. The first orders were delivered and generated more requests. The money wasn't much, but it gave me a small independence, the feeling that I could eventually support myself without depending entirely on Frank's alimony. More importantly, though, it wasn't the financial aspect. It was how I felt making those sweets. There was something deeply satisfying about transforming simple ingredients into small, sugary works of art, seeing the smile on the face of those who tried them, receiving the compliments, the requests for more. It was as if, through that manual work, I was rebuilding not just a source of income, but myself. In October, the divorce process finally moved forward. After much negotiation, we reached an agreement. We would sell the house and split the value. Frank would keep the firm, but would pay me a fair amount for my share. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was better than the initial offer, and I was tired of fighting. With the money from the sale of the house, I bought a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood not far from where Marianne lived. It was a modest place, 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, my name was the only one on a property deed. The move was painful and liberating at the same time. Painful because it meant leaving behind the scene of so many memories, the house where my children grew up. Liberating because it was a new beginning, a space all my own, without ghosts from a past that no longer existed. In the new apartment, I transformed the dining room into a production space for the suites. I bought bigger pots, specific utensils, pans, ingredients in quantity. Orders kept coming, mainly through the support group and the contacts I made there. And so, almost without realizing it, when 1997 was coming to an end, I was no longer just the abandoned woman, the betrayed wife. I was Celia, the confectioner whose sweets made people close their eyes in pleasure when they tried them. Celia, who had her own money, her own home, and who was slowly beginning to rediscover her own strength. Oh, my dears, how strange it is to look back now with the wisdom of my 78 years and realize that that moment that seemed like the end of everything was, in fact, just the beginning of an incredible journey. When 1998 arrived, I was in my new small apartment at 53 years old, with the feeling of living a life I had never imagined for myself. The divorce had been officially finalized in December, exactly 1 week before Christmas. I signed the papers with a mixture of sadness and relief, the official end of a 32-year story, but also the beginning of my new chapter. That first Christmas alone was different from everything I had experienced. The children split up. Charles and his family had lunch with Frank, while Marianne and Christine came to my apartment. I prepared a simple but special dinner. When they asked if they could help, I realized I was used to doing everything alone, being the mother who takes care of everyone. Allowing my daughters to take on part of the tasks, to contribute not just with their presence, but with work, was a small revolution in our family dynamic. During dinner, Christine announced that she had been accepted for a medical residency at an important hospital in Portland. She would be coming back home for at least a few years. Her presence in the city was one of the best gifts I received during that period. January brought an unexpected increase in sweet orders. The holiday parties had made my brownies and coconut kisses circulate among more people, generating new customers. Suddenly, I found myself having to refuse orders because I couldn't handle them all. It was Christine who suggested I hire help. "Mom, you're losing money by refusing orders. Why don't you call someone from the support group to help? I'm sure there are women there who would be happy with a job, even if temporary." The idea seemed scary at first. Hiring someone meant taking on a commitment, formalizing something that until then was just a home arrangement to supplement my income. But after spending an entire night awake to handle a large order for a quinceañera, I realized Christine was right. At the next support group meeting, I mentioned I needed help with the sweets. Immediately, 2 women volunteered. Lourdes, a 60-year-old lady who had recently lost her husband, and Joanna, a 28-year-old who was separating and urgently needed income to support 2 small children. We arranged a test the following week. I prepared my kitchen, separated the ingredients, and nervously waited for them. I had never taught anyone to make my sweets. I had never shared the special recipes I had adapted from my mother. It was like opening an intimate part of myself, something that belonged to the old Celia, the wife and mother, but which was now the foundation of the new Celia, the independent confectioner. To my surprise, the experience was wonderful. Lourdes had skilled hands and infinite patience for details. Joanna learned quickly and had creative ideas for decorations. We worked together that day, producing 5 different types of sweets for a wedding party. When we finished, exhausted but satisfied, I looked at the trays full of small, sugary works of art and felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: pride. "I think we make a good team," I said, serving them coffee at the small kitchen table. From then on, Lourdes and Joanna started coming 3 times a week to help me. I paid them by the hour, a fair amount we had agreed upon together. My dining room was no longer sufficient as a production space. Gradually, the entire social area of the apartment was taken over by utensils, packaging, pots. Christine, who stopped by frequently, began to insist that I needed my own space. "You can't continue producing at home on this scale, Mom. Besides not being practical, it's not regularized. Have you thought about renting a small commercial space?" The idea seemed absurd. Me at 53, opening a business, taking on fixed expenses like rent, bills, taxes. It seemed irresponsible, too risky. But the seed had been planted. I began to pay attention to vacant commercial spaces in the neighborhood. I even visited one or two just out of curiosity. The rental values scared me, of course, but they weren't completely out of reality, considering what I was already earning from the suites. In March 1998, I received a call that would change the course of things. It was the mother of a quinceañera, for whom I had made sweets the previous month. She wanted to know if I would accept making not just the little sweets, but the main cake for her oldest daughter's wedding. "Your brownies were the best I've ever tasted," she said. "I'm sure your cakes must be equally wonderful." I hesitated. Making cakes for parties was another level of complexity. It required techniques I didn't master, equipment I didn't have, a space larger than my small kitchen. I was about to refuse when I remembered Mrs. Odette's words at the support group. "Life begins when we leave our comfort zone." "Can I make a test for you to try?" I heard myself saying, to my own surprise. I hung up the phone and panicked. What had I just promised? To make a wedding cake. Me, who had never made anything more than simple cakes for family birthdays. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went through old recipe books, looked for references, made notes. The next morning, I went to the public library and spent hours consulting cooking magazines, copying instructions on cake decorating techniques. Then, I stopped by a party supply store and invested in pans, piping tips, cake bases, an investment that compromised a good part of my savings for the month. For an entire week, I practiced. I made and remade batters, experimented with frostings, tested fillings. My neighbors never ate so many cakes as during that period. Finally, when I thought I had reached an acceptable version, I invited the client to taste. I waited anxiously while she tried each combination I had prepared. Her face didn't reveal much, which only increased my nervousness. When she finished, she delicately wiped her lips with the napkin and looked at me seriously. "Mrs. Celia," she said, and paused for what seemed like an eternity. "This is simply divine. Not even in the best bakeries in the city have I tasted anything so special. Where did you learn to make cakes like this?" I didn't know what to answer. The truth was I hadn't learned formally. It was a combination of my mother's recipes, years of observing and helping in the kitchens of friends and relatives, and a week of intense trial and error. "It's a family recipe," I finally replied. It wasn't exactly a lie. I left that meeting with a contract to make the wedding cake, 3 tiers for 200 people, and the absolute certainty that I couldn't produce it in my apartment kitchen. I needed a professional space, and I needed it soon. It was at that moment that chance, or perhaps fate, intervened. At the next support group meeting, Teresa mentioned that her niece was closing a small cafe in the neighborhood. The location was good, but the business hadn't prospered. "She's looking for someone to take over the rent," Teresa commented. "The place already has an equipped kitchen. It would be perfect for a food business." 2 days later, I went to see the space. It was small but cozy. The kitchen, though compact, had basic industrial equipment, a 6-burner stove, a large refrigerator, stainless steel counters. The front area, which had served as a dining room for the cafe's customers, could be transformed into a customer service and product display space. The rent wasn't cheap, but it also wasn't prohibitive, especially considering I wouldn't need to invest in heavy equipment. The contract required a guarantor or 3 months' deposit in advance. I didn't have a guarantor. I didn't want to ask my children, and I certainly wouldn't ask Frank. But I had the money for the deposit, thanks to my share of the house sale. I signed the contract that same day, in a mixture of terror and excitement. As I left the property, I looked at the simple facade and visualized a name in elegant letters, Celia's Sweets. Suddenly, it was no longer just supplemental income, a hobby to occupy my mind and hands after the divorce. It was a real business, my business. The following weeks were a whirlwind. I painted the space myself, with the help of Lourdes, Joanna, and some women from the support group. I chose a soft aqua tone for the walls, contrasting with white details. I bought used tables and chairs that I carefully restored. I had a simple but elegant sign made for the facade. The official opening was on April 15th, 1998. It wasn't anything grand, just a small cocktail party for friends, family, and some customers who already knew my work. Christine and Marianne prepared an emotional speech, recalling how sweets had always been part of our family celebrations. Charles came with his wife and children, bringing flowers. Even some women from the support group showed up, proud to have witnessed the beginning of that journey. It was a special night, but the real test would come in the following days. Would I have enough customers to maintain a commercial establishment? Would people come to the store, or would I continue working only with orders? To my surprise, the movement started right on the first day. People walking down the street, attracted by the freshly painted facade and the aroma that escaped through the door, came in to try. I offered tastings of small portions of my traditional sweets, brownies, coconut kisses, wedding cookies, and also some more elaborate creations, like the coffee brownie with cardamom, which had become my specialty. In the first months, I worked harder than ever. I woke up at 5 a.m. to start production, closed the store at 7 p.m., and often continued working late, preparing special orders. Lourdes and Joanna came to work with me full-time, and soon I needed to hire another person, Helena, a 19-year-old who had just moved from a small town and was looking for her first job. The wedding cake that had precipitated all that change was an absolute success. The bride cried when she saw it, and I received so many compliments during the party that I left there with 3 new orders for other events. I discovered I had a natural talent for artistic cakes, and soon they became an important part of the business, along with traditional sweets. When we completed 6 months of operation in October 1998, we already had a loyal clientele and a growing reputation in the city. Weekends were always busy, with people coming to buy sweets for family gatherings or small parties. Orders for larger events, weddings, graduations, quinceañeras, needed to be made weeks in advance. It was during this period that I received an unexpected call, a voice I hadn't heard in months, but would recognize anywhere. "Celia, it's Frank," he said, sounding uncomfortable. "I heard you opened a confectionery. I wanted to congratulate you." I was silent, not knowing how to respond. It was the first time we had spoken directly since the finalization of the divorce. On the few occasions we had met, at Christine's graduation, at a grandchild's birthday, we had limited ourselves to distant nods. "Thank you," I finally replied, with a formality that didn't match someone who had shared a lifetime. "I'm proud of you," he continued, his voice betraying an emotion that caught me by surprise. "I always knew you were capable of great things." Part of me wanted to scream, to ask why he had never said that before, why he had to abandon me to recognize my capabilities. But another part, the new Celia who was emerging, just smiled to herself. "Life has these surprises," I replied with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "Sometimes we need to lose something to find something better." There was silence on the other end of the line. When Frank spoke again, his voice seemed more fragile. "Are you happy, Celia?" The question caught me off guard. Was I happy? I looked around at the small confectionery I had created from nothing, at the photos of my children and grandchildren on the wall, at the hands calloused by constant work, but which now belonged to me. Only to me. "I'm finding my way to happiness," I replied honestly. "And you, Frank?" Another silence, longer this time. "Things aren't as I expected," he finally admitted. "Amanda, well, it didn't work out. She left the firm last month, said she needed new challenges." I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected to feel hearing that, just a vague melancholy at the predictability of it all. The young administrative assistant had already gotten what she wanted: status, gifts, the excitement of a forbidden affair, and was ready to move on. Frank, at 54, was discovering what it meant to be a stepping stone, not a destination. "I'm sorry," I said, and to my surprise, it was true. I didn't feel joy at his suffering, just a kind of distant understanding that we all reap what we sow. "I was thinking," he continued, his voice taking on an almost shy tone, "maybe we could have coffee sometime to talk, as friends." Friends. The word echoed in my mind. This man had been my husband, my companion, my life partner for more than 3 decades. He was the father of my children, the grandfather of my grandchildren. But friend, that was something new, unexplored territory. "Maybe someday, Frank," I replied without commitment. "But now I need to hang up. I have a birthday cake to finish." And it was true. On the kitchen counter, waiting for the finishing touches, was a cake for my oldest grandson's 6th birthday. A cake I had created with my own hands, with my own talent, in my own business. That conversation with Frank marked a turning point in my emotional journey. I realized I no longer hated him, that the sharp pain of betrayal had transformed into something more distant, like an old scar that sometimes still hurts when the weather changes, but which no longer impedes movement. More importantly, I realized I no longer needed his validation, his approval, or his regret. When 1998 was coming to an end, I was firmly established on my new path. Celia's Sweets was no longer just a place where people bought brownies and cakes. It was a meeting point, a space where people shared stories, celebrated special moments, found comfort in life's small pleasures. And I, the woman who almost lost herself in the pain of abandonment, had found not just a means of survival, but a true vocation. At 53, I discovered that life can truly begin again, that it's possible to reinvent oneself, that our stories aren't defined by the chapters others write for us, but by those we write for ourselves. 1999 arrived with a different energy. It had been almost 2 years since that fateful night when I found Frank and Amanda in his office, and I barely recognized the woman I had been. The pain hadn't completely disappeared. I doubt it ever will. But it had transformed into something different, less sharp, more like a distant echo that occasionally makes itself heard. Celia's Sweets was prospering modestly. We weren't the most famous confectionery in Portland, but we had our space, our loyal clientele, our reputation for quality and warm service. Shortly after the new year, I realized we needed to expand. The kitchen space could no longer accommodate the growing demand, especially for wedding cakes, which had become our specialty. The property owner offered me the shop next door, which had been vacant for a few months. It was a perfect opportunity to expand, but also a significant financial commitment. I sat down with Christine, who had become my informal advisor for business matters, and we analyzed the numbers. "Mom, the results show we can take the risk," she said, after reviewing the balance sheet from recent months. "But it will require more from you, more employees, more responsibilities, more work." At 54, I wondered if I had the energy for it. My body no longer responded as before. The sleepless nights preparing orders left deeper marks. The back pain from standing for hours was more persistent. But there was also a new vitality, a purpose that drove me forward. "I'll do it," I decided, "but not alone. It's time to bring someone in to help me with management." Lourdes, who had been working with me since the beginning, was the natural choice. At 61, she had the maturity and reliability I needed. Plus, she had shown a special talent for organization and dealing with clients. I offered her a small partnership in the business. She would contribute work while I covered the costs of expansion. It was a perfect solution. We kept the business in the family. I wouldn't need to split myself between 2 locations, and Lourdes could start her own entrepreneurial journey with an already established brand. The renovation took 2 months. We knocked down the wall between the 2 shops, expanded the kitchen, created a more welcoming space for customers to sit and enjoy our products. We invested in better equipment, a more modern refrigerated display case, decoration that reflected the business's personality, elegant without being pretentious, welcoming without being too informal. When we reopened in March 1999, Celia's Sweets was no longer just a neighborhood confectionery. We had transformed into a reference space for special events. Invitations to gastronomy fairs began to arrive, as well as requests for interviews for local newspapers and gastronomy magazines. It was at one of these fairs, in June 1999, that fate played one of its ironic tricks on me. We had a booth at Portland's Bridal and Party Fair, an important event that brought together the main suppliers in the sector. Our tasting table attracted a constant line of people interested in trying our creations. I was explaining the details of a wedding cake to a client when I felt a gaze upon me. I looked up, and there she was, Amanda. Older than the last time I saw her, of course, but still beautiful, still with that youth that had attracted Frank. Our eyes met for an instant. I saw recognition in her eyes, followed by something that seemed to be embarrassment. She made a motion to move away, but then seemed to change her mind and walked toward me. "Mrs. Celia," she said, her voice hesitant. I took a deep breath, asking the client to give me a minute. I turned to Amanda with a calm that surprised even me. "Yes, Amanda. How are you?" She seemed uncomfortable, nervously fidgeting with her purse. "Fine. Thank you. I saw your booth and recognized your name. Your sweets look wonderful." I offered her a brownie from the nearest tray. She accepted, biting into it timidly. "It's delicious," she said, seeming genuinely impressed. There was a moment of awkward silence. What does one say to the woman who once slept with your husband, who was partly responsible for the end of a 3-decade marriage? "Are you here for work?" I finally asked, opting for neutrality. She nodded. "Yes, I work for an event decoration company now. I'm the project manager." More silence. She looked around at the well-set-up booth, at the team working coordinatedly, at the photos of elaborate cakes we had made. "You've built something incredible here," she commented. And there was something in her voice that sounded like admiration. "After I left the accounting firm, I heard you had opened a business, but I didn't imagine it was something like this." I realized then that she didn't know much about me. To Amanda, I was just the older wife, the woman who stayed home, the faded figure on the few times we crossed paths at social events before the separation. She never imagined that woman could transform into the businesswoman standing before her. "Life takes us down unexpected paths sometimes," I replied without going into details. Amanda hesitated, as if wanting to say something more. Finally, gathering courage, she asked, Do you have news from him? From Frank?" The question caught me by surprise. I didn't expect her to care. I thought about the phone call I had received from him a few months ago, his voice when he said things hadn't worked out with Amanda. "We talk occasionally because of the children and grandchildren," I replied, maintaining neutrality. "From what I know, he's well." She nodded, biting her lip. "That's good. I'm sorry, for everything." Was it a sincere apology or just a social formality? It didn't really matter. What happened between Frank, Amanda, and me was part of a past I no longer revisited frequently. "Life goes on, Amanda," I simply replied. "For all of us." She looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to decipher something. Then she thanked me for the sweet and moved away, disappearing into the crowd of fair visitors. That brief, unexpected encounter left me thoughtful for the rest of the day. Not because of Amanda's presence itself, but because of what she represented. A closed chapter of my life, a wound that had healed without my fully realizing it. That night, back at the confectionery, I shared the episode with Lourdes as we closed the register. "How did you feel seeing her?" asked my friend and now business partner, concern evident on her face. I reflected for a moment. "At peace," I replied, surprised by my own realization. As if that story no longer had power over me. Lourdes smiled, squeezing my hand over the counter. "That's the real victory, Celia. Not the business's success, but that liberation." She was right, of course. The confectionery, the professional recognition, the financial independence, all of that was valuable. But the true achievement was internal. It was the woman I had become, the strength I had discovered in myself. The rest of 1999 passed quickly in a whirlwind of work and growth. We hired 2 more employees to handle the increasing demand. I started teaching small confectionery workshops on Saturdays, sharing basic techniques with interested customers. They weren't formal classes, I didn't have training for that, but relaxed sessions where I shared what I had learned through practice. It was in one of those workshops in November that I met Antonio. He was 60, a retired university professor of American literature, and he was there because he wanted to learn to make sweets to surprise his grandchildren at Christmas. My wife always took care of that part, he explained with a melancholic smile. Since she passed away 2 years ago, family celebrations have never been the same. There was something charming about the way he spoke, about his large hands, a bit clumsy, trying to shape the brownies, about the genuine attention with which he listened to my instructions. At the end of the class, he thanked me effusively and asked if he could come back the following week to learn more. Of course, I replied, feeling an unexpected warmth in my cheeks. It will be a pleasure. Antonio became a constant presence at the Saturday workshops. After a few weeks, he started staying after class, helping me organize the kitchen while we talked about books, music, the city, life. It was easy to talk to him. There were no expectations, no shared past, just 2 mature people discovering affinities. In December, he invited me to a concert at the university. I hesitated. I hadn't gone out with a man since I met Frank, decades ago. The idea made me nervous and a bit scared. It's not a romantic date if you don't want it to be, he said, noticing my hesitation. Just 2 friends enjoying good music together. I accepted, and it was an enchanting evening. Antonio was cultured without being pretentious, attentive without being invasive. We talked for hours after the concert, sitting in a quiet cafe near the university. When he dropped me off at home, he didn't try anything beyond a respectful kiss on the cheek and a thank you for the company. Our friendship grew naturally in the following months. He introduced me to poets I had never read, to music I had never heard. I taught him to make homemade bread, to recognize the right point for brownies, to appreciate life's small, everyday pleasures. In March 2000, Antonio invited me to see his house, a spacious residence near the university campus with an impressive library and a well-kept garden. As we walked among the rose bushes, he cultivated himself. He gently took my hand. Celia, I know we both carry stories, losses, scars. I'm not asking you to forget your past, nor will I forget mine. But I'd like to know if we can build something together in the time we're given. It wasn't a passionate declaration from an impetuous young man. It was the serene invitation of a mature man who knew the value of companionship, affinity, affection, built day by day. I need time, Antonio, I replied honestly. I spent so much time being someone's wife that I'm still learning to be just Celia. He smiled understandingly. All the time in the world. I'm in no hurry. And so we continued in a slow dance of approach and discovery. It wasn't the overwhelming passion of youth, but something deeper, calmer, wiser. Sometimes he would come to the confectionery and sit reading while I worked. Other times I would go to his house and we'd cook together or simply talk late into the night, sharing stories, fears, dreams. In May 2000, unexpected news shook our routine. Christine came to visit me at the confectionery, visibly agitated. Mom, do you know about Dad? My heart raced. What happened to him? He's hospitalized. It seems he had the beginning of a heart attack last night. Frank, hospitalized. The news hit me with surprising force. Despite everything that had happened between us, he was still the father of my children, still someone who had occupied an important space in my life. Which hospital? I asked, already taking off my apron. Lourdes looked at me with concern. Do you want me to go with you? I shook my head. It's not necessary. Christine will go with me. The hospital was a few miles from the confectionery. During the drive, Christine updated me on the situation. Frank had felt chest discomfort while at the office. A colleague took him to the emergency room, where he was diagnosed with the beginning of a heart attack. It hadn't been serious, but the doctors kept him hospitalized for observation and tests. Charles is with him now, Christine explained. Marianne went earlier but had to leave to pick up the kids from school. We arrived at the hospital and went straight up to the room indicated at reception. Charles was sitting in an armchair next to the bed where Frank rested, apparently asleep. My son stood up when he saw me, surprised. "Mom, I didn't expect you to come." I gave him a quick hug. "How is he?" "Stable. The doctors say it was a warning. He didn't have serious heart damage, but needs to change some habits, get follow-up care." I looked at the figure in the bed. Frank seemed much older than his 56 years. His hair, which already had gray strands when we separated, was now completely white. His face had new lines, deeper ones, marking his forehead and the corners of his eyes. He was thinner too, almost fragile. At that moment, his eyes opened. He blinked several times, confused. Then he recognized me. "Celia." His voice was hoarse, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Charles quickly intervened. "I'm going to get coffee. I'll be back in a few minutes." When we were alone, I approached the bed. "I came to see how you are," I replied simply. "The children were worried." He nodded, adjusting himself on the pillows to a more upright position. "You didn't need to trouble yourself. It wasn't anything serious." "The beginning of a heart attack is never nothing serious, Frank. What did the doctors say?" He sighed, running his hand through his white hair. "The usual. Need to stop smoking, exercise, eat better, reduce stress." Frank seemed defeated, as if those medical recommendations were too heavy a burden to carry. For the first time, I saw beyond the anger and hurt I had cultivated for so long. I saw only an aging man facing his own mortality. "Do you have help at home?" I asked, remembering the apartment where he lived alone since Amanda had left him. He shook his head. "I hired a cleaning lady who comes twice a week. For the rest, I manage." We were silent for a few moments. It was strange being there beside the hospital bed of the man who had broken my heart, feeling not anger or resentment, but a kind of distant compassion. "How's the confectionery?" he finally asked, clearly trying to change the subject. "Good. We expanded last year. Now we have a bigger space, more employees." He smiled slightly. "I always knew you'd be good at it. You always had a special talent for making people happy with your food." It was a sincere compliment, perhaps the first in a long time that didn't come loaded with implications or regrets, just an honest recognition of something he had always known about me. "Thank you," I replied, feeling a strange peace. "It's work that fulfills me." We talked for a few more minutes about the children, the grandchildren, trivialities. When Charles returned with coffee, I said goodbye, promising to come back another day if necessary. On the way back to the confectionery, Christine looked at me curiously. "How was it?" I reflected for a moment. "Different from what I expected. I didn't feel anything I thought I would feel." "And what did you expect to feel?" "I don't know. Maybe satisfaction at seeing him vulnerable, maybe renewed anger. But I didn't feel any of that. Just understanding, I think, that we all age, we all face consequences, we all need to move on." That night, I told Antonio about the hospital visit. We were sitting on the porch of my house, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the starry sky. It was like closing a circle, I concluded, as if a chapter that was left ajar could finally be completely closed. Antonio took my hand, his eyes reflecting the understanding of someone who had also closed painful chapters. "I think that's called forgiveness, Celia. Not necessarily forgiving the other, but forgiving yourself for having suffered, for having allowed pain to occupy so much space." His words touched something deep in me. That was it. I hadn't forgiven Frank for the betrayal, but I had forgiven myself for having built my identity around him, for having lost myself when he left, for having taken so long to find my own strength. "You know," I said, looking at the stars, "I think I finally understand what the real revenge is for those who hurt us." Antonio raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what would that be?" "Being happy." I replied with quiet certainty. Not performative happiness, the kind we display so the other person sees and regrets, but real, deep happiness that comes from being at peace with who we are, with the choices we've made, with the path we've traveled. He smiled, squeezing my hand affectionately. And are you achieving that revenge? I looked at him, at the starry sky, at the small but cozy house I had created for myself, and I thought about the confectionery, the children, the grandchildren, the true friendships I had cultivated in recent years. I'm on the way, I replied with a serene smile, and it's a surprisingly sweet journey. That night, when Antonio said goodbye with a soft kiss on my lips, our first real kiss, I didn't feel guilt, fear, or the sense of betraying a past that no longer belonged to me. I felt only the promise of a future still being written, a new chapter waiting to be lived. And so, my dears, I discovered that life has many unexpected curves, some painful, others wonderful, that our greatest challenges can become our greatest blessings, that it's never too late to start over, to reinvent ourselves, to find joy in small and large achievements. But there's still more to tell about how all this brought me here, at 78 years old, sharing my story with you. The 2000s marked the beginning of a new phase in my life. At 55, I experienced sensations I had never known before. The freedom to make my own decisions without consulting anyone, the pride of building something with my own hands, and the sweetness of a relationship based on mutual respect and admiration. My relationship with Antonio flourished slowly, like a plant that needs time to create strong roots. There was no urgency of youth, just the quiet certainty of two people who knew the value of genuine companionship. We met 2 or 3 times a week, dividing our time between my house, his, and of course, the confectionery. Antonio was enchanted by the Celia's Sweets environment, often bringing a book and spending hours sitting at a table in the corner, watching the movement, chatting with customers, occasionally helping when the flow increased. His large hands, a bit clumsy, would never master the refined techniques of confectionery, but he had a natural talent for making customers feel welcome, for telling stories that enchanted children while they waited for their sweets. In 2001, when my oldest granddaughter turned 15, I personally prepared every detail of the party. The 5-tier cake was my masterpiece up to that point, each layer representing a phase of her life, from childhood to that moment of transition to adulthood. Antonio stayed by my side throughout the celebration, holding my hand when I got emotional seeing the girl, so similar to Marianne at the same age, blowing out the candles. "You created something extraordinary, Celia," he told me. And he wasn't just referring to the cake. It was also that year that I made an important decision for the business. Our clientele had expanded beyond the neighborhood, and we received orders from all over the city. The space, even after the expansion, was starting to feel tight again, especially during peak times like Christmas and wedding season. Lourdes, who had become not just my business partner, but a dear friend, suggested we open a second store, this time in a more central neighborhood. "We have customers who come from across the city to buy your cakes, Celia," she argued. "Imagine if we made their lives easier with a more accessible location." The idea was tempting, but also frightening. Expanding meant taking on new risks, hiring more people, dividing my attention between 2 locations. At 56, I wondered if I had the energy for this new challenge. It was Christine who helped me make the decision. One Sunday afternoon, while we were having lunch as a family at my house, she brought a folder full of spreadsheets and projections. "I did a complete analysis, Mom. The numbers support the expansion, and it doesn't have to be just you managing everything. It's past time you brought someone from the family into the business, don't you think?" I looked at her, surprised. Christine was a doctor, had a promising career at the hospital where she worked. She had never shown interest in getting involved with the confectionery, beyond being a loyal customer and a proud daughter. "Are you suggesting—" She smiled, that smile that always reminded me of when she was little and had a mischievous idea. "I'm thinking about a career change. I actually like medicine, But in recent years, I've felt something is missing. Watching you transform your passion into a successful business, I realized I also want to create something with my own hands. Christine's proposal was clear. She would invest her savings in the new store and take over management of the new location, while I continued focused on the original store and creating new products. It was a perfect solution. We kept the business in the family, I wouldn't need to split myself between two locations, and Christine could start her own entrepreneurial journey with an already established brand. In March 2002, we inaugurated the second Celia's Sweets unit in an elegant Portland neighborhood. The space was larger than the original, with a slightly different concept. Besides sweets and cakes for parties, we offered a small cafe where customers could enjoy our creations, accompanied by specialty coffees and teas. The local press covered the opening, highlighting not just the quality of the products, but also the story behind the business. How a middle-aged woman had reinvented herself after a traumatic divorce, transforming a home skill into a successful enterprise. The article, published in a major newspaper, left me with mixed feelings. On one hand, I felt proud to see my journey recognized and valued. On the other, it was strange to see intimate aspects of my life exposed that way, transformed into a kind of inspirational tale for public consumption. "Does this bother you?" Antonio asked after reading the article. I reflected for a moment. Isn't it uncomfortable to see my pain transformed into an overcoming narrative? He considered the question with the seriousness he always dedicated to my concerns. "Maybe," he finally replied, "but it's also powerful to see how your story can inspire other people in similar situations. How many women of our generation feel invisible after losing the role of wife? How many believe it's too late to start over?" His words echoed in me in the following days, especially when I started receiving messages and visits from women who had read the article. Some came to the confectionery just to shake my hand and say my story had given them hope. Others sought me out to ask for advice on how to start their own business, how to overcome fear of the unknown, how to find strength amid pain. I realized that without intending to, I had become a kind of reference for middle-aged women seeking reinvention. It was a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but which I accepted with humility and gratitude for the opportunity to transform my own scar into a bridge for other people. It was in this context that the invitation arose to participate in a program on local radio, a special interview for International Women's Day in March 2003. I was initially reluctant. I had never been someone who sought the spotlight, but Antonio encouraged me. "Your voice needs to be heard, Celia. Not just for you, but for all those who haven't yet found the courage to use their own voice." The interview was an unexpected success. What should have been a half-hour conversation extended to almost 2, with listeners calling to ask questions, share their own stories, thank me for the inspiration. The station received so much positive feedback that they invited me to a weekly segment where I could share not just recipes, but reflections on life, work, relationships. Thus was born Conversations with Celia, a radio program that would become an important part of my life for years to come. Every Thursday, for an hour, I talked with listeners about the most varied topics, from how to make the perfect brownie to how to rebuild self-esteem after a separation. I had no pretensions of being a therapist or professional counselor. I was just a woman sharing her experience, her discoveries, her reflections on life. The program grew, gained popularity especially among women over 50. I received letters, yes, physical letters, not just emails, from listeners from various cities, some telling how they had found courage to change their lives after hearing my story. In one of those letters, a 62-year-old lady told how she had opened a small bed and breakfast at the beach after separating from her husband of 40 years. "I thought my life was over," she wrote, "until I heard you talking about how the end of one chapter can be the beginning of a much more interesting story." On the personal front, my relationship with Antonio deepened. In 2004, after 4 years together, we decided to live in the same house, not out of financial necessity or social pressure, but from the simple desire to share our daily lives. We chose to buy a new place that didn't carry memories from our previous relationships. A spacious house in a quiet neighborhood with a garden where Antonio could cultivate his roses and a roomy office where I could experiment with new recipes. We didn't officially marry. We both felt that papers no longer mattered at this stage of life. The commitment we had to each other was deeper than any contract could express. It was based on mutual respect, sincere admiration, love that grows slowly, like a good wine that improves with time. In 2005, something happened that I never imagined possible. Frank showed up at the confectionery. It had been years since I'd seen him, except on family occasions like weddings and graduations, where we maintained a polite distance. He was older, naturally, but seemed in better shape than when I visited him in the hospital 5 years earlier. He dressed with discreet elegance, his white hair well trimmed, his face marked by wrinkles that told stories. He hesitated at the door, clearly uncomfortable, until Lourdes recognized him and discreetly called me in the office. "Your ex-husband is here," she whispered, concern evident in her eyes. "Do you want me to say you're busy?" I took a deep breath. "No, it's fine. I'll see him." I walked to the main room, where Frank waited standing, looking at the sweet displays with apparent interest. When he saw me, he straightened up, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture I recognized from so many years of living together. "Hello, Frank," I greeted, keeping a neutral tone. "How can I help you?" He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Can we talk in private? I won't take much of your time." I led him to my small office in the back of the store. I offered him coffee, which he accepted with a nod. We sat facing each other, separated by the old desk I had rescued from an antique dealer and restored with my own hands. "You've transformed this place," he commented, looking around. "Everything is very beautiful." "Thank you, but I imagine you didn't come here to compliment the decor." He smiled slightly, acknowledging my characteristic frankness. "No, indeed. I came because I'm retiring. I'm going to pass the firm to Charles. He's proven to be an excellent accountant, better than I ever was." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. Frank rotated the coffee cup between his fingers, searching for words. "When you approach the moment of ending a career, of passing the torch, you end up reflecting on life, on the choices we made," he continued. "I didn't always make the right choices, Celia. You know that better than anyone." I remained silent, allowing him to follow his own pace. There was no anger in me, just a tranquil curiosity about where that conversation would lead us. "I came to apologize," he said finally, raising his eyes to meet mine. "Not just for what happened with Amanda, but for all the years I didn't value what we had, when I didn't see your strength, your talent, your dedication." The words were sincere. I could feel it. There was no rehearsal in them, just the raw honesty of a man facing his mistakes. "Why now, Frank? After so many years?" He sighed, running his hand through his white hair. "Because now I understand better. Because I saw what you built after our separation. Because I listened to your radio program and realized the impact your words have on so many people's lives." I was surprised. "You listened to my program?" He nodded, a bit embarrassed. "Every Thursday." At first, I confess, it was out of curiosity. Then because I really appreciate what you say, the way you approach difficult topics with so much humanity. We were silent for a moment, absorbing the strangeness of that situation. The man who had broken my heart listening to my weekly reflections on life, love, overcoming. "I accept your apology, Frank," I said finally. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace." He nodded, understanding the nuance of my response. "Are you happy, Celia?" "Really happy." The question caught me by surprise, not because of its content, but because of the sincerity with which it was asked. I thought about the prosperous confectionery, about the 2 stores now managed by a competent team that included my own daughter. I thought about the radio program, about the letters I received, about the women who found inspiration in my story. I thought about Antonio, about the quiet, deep love we shared, about the house we were building together. I thought about the grandchildren growing up, about Sunday lunches, about small daily joys. Yes, I replied, with a certainty that came from deep in my soul. I'm happier now than I ever imagined I could be. He smiled, a sad but genuine smile. I'm happy for you. Truly. When Frank said goodbye, there was no drama or resentment, just the quiet closure of a chapter that had been turned long ago. That night, I told Antonio about the unexpected visit. We were sitting on the porch of our new house, watching the sunset that painted Portland's sky with shades of orange and pink. "How did you feel?" he asked, always attentive to the nuances of my feelings. I reflected for a moment. "At peace," I finally replied, as if a circle had completely closed. There are no more loose ends, no unresolved issues. Just acceptance that everything happened exactly as it should have happened. The following years brought new chapters, new challenges, new joys. In 2008, my first great-grandchild was born, a girl with the same curious eyes that Marianne had as a baby. In 2010, Christine expanded the confectionery concept, opening a third store with a different format, a confectionery school where we offered courses for professionals and amateurs. In 2012, at 66, I decided to gradually step away from the daily management of the stores, not out of exhaustion or inability, but from the desire to dedicate more time to other projects. The radio program had evolved into a broader format, now broadcast in several Oregon cities. I received invitations to speak at events focused on women's entrepreneurship, reinvention and maturity, overcoming personal challenges. Antonio accompanied me whenever possible, my loyal and loving companion. When he couldn't go, he waited at home with a dinner prepared by his own hands, now more skilled in the kitchen, eager to hear the details of each event. In 2015, we received the news that no one is prepared to hear. Antonio was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. The doctors were honest from the beginning. The prognosis wasn't favorable. We would have, with luck, a few months together. Those were, paradoxically, some of the most precious moments of our relationship. Each day gained special meaning. Each conversation, unique depth. Each touch, indescribable tenderness. We didn't waste time with lamentations or revolts against the inevitable. Instead, we concentrated our energies on fully living the time we had left. Antonio passed away on an October morning, serenely, in our home, holding my hand. His last word was my name, whispered with so much love that I can still hear it in the quietest moments. The grief was deep, but different from the devastation I felt when Frank left me. There was no betrayal or rejection, just the natural pain of physical separation from someone deeply loved. Antonio had given me 8 years of true, respectful, nurturing love. He had taught me it was possible to love again, differently, but equally valid. In the months that followed, work was my refuge. I returned to frequenting the confectionery daily, not so much to manage, but to be present, to feel the warmth of the oven, the aroma of the sweets, the bustle of customers. I resumed the radio program, now also addressing topics like grief, new beginnings, the art of finding meaning in loss. In 2018, at 72, I received an unexpected invitation to write a book about my journey. At first, the idea seemed absurd to me. Who would be interested in the story of an ordinary lady who had simply lived her life the best way possible? But the publisher insisted. There was something universal in my journey, something that could resonate with people of all ages, especially women facing important transitions. I accepted the challenge. For a year, I dedicated myself to organizing my memories, reflecting on the lessons learned, finding words to express feelings that often seemed beyond language. The book, Sweet New Beginnings: How I Lost a Husband and Found Myself, was published in 2019 and to my surprise had a warm reception. The book signings were emotional moments where I met women, and some men, who identified with different aspects of my story. Some came after traumatic divorces, others after professional losses, Still others seeking inspiration to start a new chapter after retirement or the departure of children from home. It was at one of these signings in a bookstore in downtown Portland that I ran into Amanda again. She was in line, holding my book, visibly nervous. When her turn came, she placed the book on the table and said in a low voice, "I don't know if you remember me." Of course I remembered. Her face was more mature. Fine lines marked the corners of her eyes. Her hair was shorter and with some gray strands, but she was still unmistakably the woman who had once been in my husband's arms. "I remember, Amanda," I replied calmly. "How are you?" She seemed surprised by my tranquil reaction. "Fine, thank you. I read your book twice, actually. It's extraordinary." I thanked her for the compliment, waiting for her to continue. There was something more she wanted to say. I could tell by the way she hesitated, how her fingers drummed nervously on the book's cover. "I wanted you to know that I've learned a lot from my mistakes," she said finally. "What I did to you, to your marriage, I have no excuses. I was young, selfish, but that doesn't justify it. I just hope you know that person isn't who I am anymore." I looked at her, really looked beyond the crystallized image I held in my memory. I saw a middle-aged woman carrying her own scars, seeking her own redemption. "We all evolve, Amanda," I replied, as I signed her book. "We all deserve the chance to become better people." When I returned the book, I added, "You know, in retrospect, maybe I should thank you." She looked at me, confused. "Thank me? If it weren't for that night at the office, I might never have discovered my own strength. I would never have opened the confectionery, written this book, touched the lives of so many people. Sometimes, what seems like our biggest disaster ends up being our biggest gift." Tears glistened in her eyes. "You're extraordinary, Mrs. Celia. Now I understand why this book is touching so many people." That encounter, as unlikely as it was meaningful, was one more confirmation that life rarely follows a predictable script. The people who hurt us can become catalysts for our transformation. The endings we fear can be just the prelude to much richer beginnings. Today, at 78 years old, I look back with a mixture of astonishment and gratitude for the path traveled. The Celia's Sweets chain now has 5 stores, managed mainly by Christine, with the help of some grandchildren who showed interest in the business. The radio program transformed into a podcast, reaching an even wider audience. The book is in its 4th edition, and there are talks about a possible film adaptation, something that makes me laugh at how surreal it seems. Frank passed away last year at 76, at peace with his family by his side. I was present at the funeral, not out of obligation, but out of respect for a shared history, for children and grandchildren we love, for decades that, despite everything, formed who I am today. I live alone now, by choice, in the same house I shared with Antonio. The rose garden he planted continues to flourish, cared for by my hands, which, though more wrinkled and less agile, still find joy in creating beauty, whether through flowers, words, or the sweets I occasionally still make for my great-grandchildren. Life taught me that there's no magic formula for happiness, no foolproof recipe for overcoming adversity. Each person has their own path, their own rhythm, their own ingredients. The important thing is to remember that no matter how painful the present moment is, it's just that, a moment. And moments pass, transform, make room for new possibilities. If there's one message I'd like to leave for you, my dears, who have followed my story this far, it's this. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to discover dormant talents, to cultivate new friendships, to open your heart to love, to find purpose and meaning. Life doesn't end with a divorce, a retirement, a loss. It just changes direction, offering new paths, new landscapes, new adventures. And now, as I close this account, I want to thank each of you who dedicated time to hear the story of a lady who simply refused to give up, who found in the crumbs of a broken heart the ingredients to create something new, something sweet, something truly her own. If my story touched your heart in some way, if it brought hope for a difficult moment, if it inspired a small step toward your own new beginning, then the whole journey was worth it. Because in the end, maybe that's what really matters. Not just the lives we live, but the lives we touch along the way. Until we meet again, my dears, always remember, the best chapter of your story may be exactly the one you haven't written yet. And wherever you are, find sweetness even in life's most bitter moments. With love, Celia. And before I say goodbye, my dears, don't forget to leave your like on this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel if you haven't already, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to start over. Each like, each subscription, each comment makes me feel that my story was worth telling. Thank you so much for following me this far, and until the next video.